So welcome everyone to our weekly Dial Global virtual workshop. Today we're absolutely thrilled to have the fantastic Kristen Anderson with us. Now, Kristin is the Global Chief Diversity Officer for Barilla, which you may have heard of, is a large FMCG organization. Kristin's actually had a phenomenal background working within other global FMCG organizations. She's worked all over the world, even in Shanghai, which I've had the opportunity to learn about previously, and so a lot of international experience, and really had the chance throughout her career to be able to observe lots of different cultural idiosyncrasies and details, and is very, very passionate about people and obviously moving the diversity and inclusion and belonging agenda. Today, Kristin's very kindly talking to us about leveraging the collective energy of our employees around the world to make culture change. She's done some brilliant presentations previously around employee resource groups, which is what we're going to be talking about today, and how they can ultimately benefit your organizations. So we're going to be hearing a little bit about Kristin's story, but also the journey that Barilla has gone on and the positive differences that she has made using the power of the various different networks. So without further ado, I'm going to hand across to you, Kristin.
Thank you, Layla, so much. It's really a pleasure to be here for the Dial virtual workshop. I'm calling here from my apartment in Italy. As you can see, the old stone and wood in the background, but thank you for the invitation. I really enjoy not only sharing what we've been working on in Barilla, but also hearing the questions, because every time I have a chance to connect with other interested people on D&I, I learn something new and I can bring it back to Barilla. So a little, just two words about myself. As you mentioned, I mean, Layla and I met a few months ago, I think it was during lockdown. And so we had a good chance to connect about our different cultural backgrounds. As you can tell from my accent, I'm American, but I've been living here in Italy for the last 10 years, trying to learn Italian with an American accent, so it's pretty much a giveaway. I work for Barilla, which is still a family-owned company, pasta sauce manufacturer, but also a lot of bakery products. You probably maybe even know some of the brands, like Vaza Crackers is a part of Barilla brand, Harry's, Molino Bianco, so it's quite a big business in Italy and in Europe. I came into this role as Chief Diversity Officer a bit by maybe not a usual track. I'm a chemical engineer by training. I went to university in the US and my master's degree also, and not very many women engineers. So I started my career in kind of maybe a more male-dominated field. So I knew what it was like to be kind of the young woman engineer. I started with Kraft Foods and I worked in Chicago for many years. And then I ran the R&D in Australia, in Melbourne, for 3 years, and then 5 years in Munich with Kraft, which then became Mondelez. And I left and ran the R&D and built an R&D organization in Shanghai, as Layla mentioned, for Coca-Cola, all with an R&D background. That's why Barilla hired me. Barilla hired me to run part of the research group here in Italy. But then when we started our D&I journey, we formed a committee made of internal employees and external experts, and we the CEO and the chairman, Guido Barilla, created the Chief Diversity Officer role. And that's how I started it, not as Chief Diversity Officer, but as member of the committee. And then I moved into this role more than 4 years ago. So that's how we started our journey. And today I want to talk to you more of our recent work on employee resource groups, because, again, all of you are working on D&I and you probably have a lot of leadership commitment from a CEO or from the head of HR. You may have a committee or a board, and you have external experts, your partners with other organizations to learn from them. But one of the big pieces that helped us move along the culture change was engaging our employees. If we move, Layla, to the next slide. So this is the journey that we began almost 7 years ago, and I'm not going to tell you about each of those milestones, but we did the work at the beginning, because we didn't start 20 years ago, it was more recent, with things like training for all employees, the D&I survey, which we now conduct every 18 to 24 months, feedback training, being members of parks or GLAD, learning from others. And then you can see a button there called Voce. That's when in 2015, we started our ERGs. Some more recent things that we've done, especially this year, that I'd like to highlight is that this year we've achieved gender pay equality. So That's that very last button there you can see with the men and women. So we're proud globally that we have no gender pay gap. And that was one of our big further steps. But I want to talk today about the evolution of our ERGs. So what did our employees tell us during our D&I survey? We conducted the first survey in 2014, and we had not done a lot of surveys around the Barilla world. So for many employees, it was the first time they had a chance to give anonymous feedback that wasn't in a focus group. And people said they wanted more inclusion of all diversities to help grow the business. That was one of the questions that people said was not favorable. So we needed to work on this. And so what we did is we started, if you go to the next slide, that we started our employee resource groups in America. And since 2015, we've grown them with lots of learnings, some things that we didn't do well, and we had to go redo, learning from other companies who have done this quite well. And now we have more than 1,300 employees. Our total population is 8,400 employees. So we feel pretty happy that we have engaged a lot of employees around the world. Also, most recently, we started ERGs in the factories. And just early this year, we started one in the sales force in France. So we're trying some little different models to see if they work. Can we go to the next slide, please? So we did need to do a lot of education on why people should form and participate in the employee resource group. As an American, I know very well that it maybe is a little more culturally common for us to say, let's form a group to make changes, let's form a group to work on this. But we realized when we took our ERG from America and we tried to kind of cut and paste it, VOCE is the ERG for LGBTQ plus inclusion, plus allies inclusion in the workplace. And so we said, we'll launch VOCE in Italy. And I was telling Layla this, that we had an event with David Mixner. Maybe many of you know his name. He's a very famous LGBT and civil rights activist, and he's on our board. So he's really helped us a lot. So we had an event with him in Parma, in the headquarters in Parma, and we had a lot of people, more than 100 people there. So I thought, wow, we're going to have a lot of people who want to form this ERG. And we had a sign-up sheet, and at the end we had 10. And we started talking to people about why, aren't you going to be part of the ERG? Well, I don't understand what it is. How are we going to make a change? What is our role? And a little bit, how is it going to help the company and how is it going to help me? So this is just an example of the education and the communication that we spent a lot of effort, and it took years, to tell people in town hall meetings, with videos. We had ERG open days that, employee resource groups are to make the invisible needs of the minority visible to the majority, to share experiences. You can be involved. ERGs will drive culture change. But it didn't happen overnight. We had a strong support from our chairman, the Barilla family, and the CEO, who publicly spoke about ERGs are important for Barilla for the future, because we need to change the culture to be more inclusive, or we will not, we will not be successful in the new world. And even to the point of having an ERG year of ERGs, because every year we have a year of, and that one year was the year of ERGs. So we started kind of disseminating this, this information and this education process. Can we go to the next slide?
Just before we go to the next
Yes,
slide, Kristin, we have actually already quite a few questions, and I think this is just a perfect brief segue into a number of the questions that we had by email for those that want to watch on demand but couldn't come today and really wanted to. And we've got, and I should point out here, is, as you have well articulated, is everyone is ultimately at a different phase of the journey, and this can take a long time. I know us as diversity and inclusion practitioners tend to be by nature quite impatient for change and wanting things to happen quickly, but ultimately everyone is at a different phase of that journey. Now, some of the questions that we've had are specifically around, one, whether you notice differences in engagement between certain groups of people. For example, we have women, and how do you go about trying to engage new audiences versus other groups, such as ones which are specifically around race and ethnicity, especially if that is something that hasn't been discussed necessarily to date. So we've had quite a lot of questions around how and where to start. Now, I know this is different for different businesses, but how and where to start. We had quite a lot of emails around decisions over which groups to actually put in place, and whether you would recommend, say, going with gender as a first, because some members and some individuals who have emailed have pointed out that gender seems the easiest place to start. We hear this quite a common piece, is do we just go and start with gender? Obviously you went you know, in with a strong presence on LGBTQ+, and everyone's story is different, but wondered whether you had any thoughts around the starting place,
Sure.
segregating up the employee resource groups, and also then latterly whether you notice significant differences in how you're honing the engagement to drive those audiences.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense. Very good question. So let me start with the beginning, just one word of background. When we started our D&I journey, our external experts gave us advice and said, do not make your D&I journey about one specific affinity. If you start talking about it's about gender equality only, you will not engage everyone. And you will probably in some ways turn off men who say, okay, D&I is just about women. So we were very clear that our strategy encompassed 5 areas: generations, LGBT, people with disabilities, gender, and multiculturality. So we always talked about that, but in our training, in our why are we doing D&I, the world is changing and it's about ethnicity, race, multicultural, it's about all of it, Generation X, all the generations working together. Then we were very clear that we can't work on 5 things at one time. No one expects you to go after 5 different areas in the same force. So we said we would pick certain areas to focus on, and we did focus on LGBT, we focused on gender, and then we, in this education process of ERGs, we didn't form them. We educated the employees on what they are, told them how you could form them, and let them decide. If you have enough passion that you have a group who wants to form an ERG about gender equality, then let them. But if you, in one site, if they want to form about LGBT inclusion plus allies, then you let them, but you need to have the governance. You need to tell them how to form and what this group is going to need to do. You need to have some strong leaders. We usually always have co-leaders. And then they need to elect an executive sponsor. So we have a governance process. The other point that I would say that we learned is when we formed our gender, I should say we, it's not we, when the employees wanted to form gender equality ERG, they called it balance because we let them choose their name, the name and the logo. But we strongly suggested to make it gender and work-life balance. So there's 2 objectives in that ERG, and we have a lot of men. Because it's not like this is all about women. It's also about how I can work better and manage everything better. And everyone wants to have a better work-life balance. And talk about that during COVID, this is what you hear, you know, it's all blurred together. So we now have even that ERG working on ways that you can unblur the lines. So, so I think the point of the question of how do you decide what ERG, I think don't decide, you know, educate the employees and let them decide, because then they're the ones coming to you. They have the passion. This happened in Parma. After we educate on ERGs, VOCA had already kind of started, I told you, with 10 members. But then now it's our biggest ERG in Parma. We have 220 members because it's taken time, but people have the passion of. But then we have a generations ERG, and that was because 2 people really liked the idea. They had a WhatsApp group already, and we said, well, that could be you could be an ERG. Let's talk about it. Another 2 people came and said, we think we need to talk about more multiculturality in Parma. It's because it's a headquarters, very Italian, a lot of Italians. So if you're not Italian or you don't speak Italian well, like me, you know, you might feel excluded. So giving them the governance, I said, go off and talk to your colleagues. Find out if you can get 20, 30 people interested in forming this, and then let's go through the charter. Let's get a sponsor. We need an executive sponsor. In America, they formed a race ethnicity ERG called Alianza. We like the Italian names. Alianza means alliance. Voce means voice. And that's about Latinx, people of color, Black, African Americans together. They formed it, and they have, you know, we have a governance, as I said, a charter, work plan. You know, you have to show your actions every 6 months. You need regular meetings with your sponsor. So a lot of those things help us sustain the momentum and the motivation. Leila, does that answer part of your question?
It absolutely does. Thank you. And I really, I think it's great advice actually letting this be employee led, and obviously the clues in the title to agree with it being employee resource group. But I think actually putting that out there is key, especially when it comes to messaging and controlling narratives and everything like that. It's not, and we have heard from a number of individuals, how do we make this seem like something which is genuinely, about the people, as opposed to something that we're doing to be a tick box exercise, all that kind of piece. And so actually, pushing this out there, once you've then got the exec sponsor and the governance in place, which I know you're going to talk about, really allowing that to be guided by those within the organization. Because as we've heard already, and from a number of people who've written in, is actually they're all at different stages. They've got very different makeups of people within their organization. Some are great potentially when it comes to gender, but not so good on LGBTQ+ or race and ethnicity. There's so many different facets that actually encompass diversity, inclusion, and belonging. It's really important to allow everyone to feel they're welcome. And as you'd said, not just about if it's gender, oh well, I'm a male, I'm middle-aged, white, that means it doesn't relate to me. Absolutely not. Everyone can be involved and then also can be an ally. One quick question just before we move on. We have had a number of others as well, but I just want to give chance for us to get through obviously the presentation, because I think some of these questions might be answered as we go. But one question around one of your other slides was around the gender pay equality, which is excellent and a great milestone to achieve. So it's really helpful to see that journey that you've been on. The question here is, how did you achieve gender pay equality? Was it the case that women just got raises? How did that work?
Okay, sure. So we started working on assessing what our gender pay gap, which is the first step. And I tell people, I know it's a difficult journey. It's not easy. It's going to cost money, but you need to start looking at where you have. You don't even know what your gender pay gap is and where the issues are. You'll never have a plan to resolve it with a commitment to eliminate it. So the first thing in 2016 is we worked with, here in Parma, with the University of Parma, their statistics and economics department, and we developed a regression analysis tool that helped us go through all of our SAP data to basically eliminate the justifiable reasons you would have a pay gap. So someone who's had high ratings versus someone who's had no, or someone who's worked longer in the role or less long. So then you get to the unjustified cases. Then we, since 17 and 2018, HR did this and led this. It was a fantastic effort, worked to eliminate, to reduce each of those cases. Some of they could eliminate in 1 year, some it took longer, so they did stepwise. What's interesting is we didn't find it was always women were paid less. We have cases where men were paid less for equal work. So in some countries we had both cases. Then in last year, we still had a little more than a 1% gap. And the CEO said, we want to finish this work. So let's just finish it. And HR said it's going to cost this much money. And the CEO said, okay, that's, the CEO and the chairman said, I give you the money. And so that's why this year is we eliminate gender pay gap, and we've achieved gender pay equality. Now, the other piece about it is that you need to then develop a process so that this becomes part of the HR systems, because if you don't, you do a one-time shot and then you start having other cases. So the process is now embedded in our HR systems. And the second thing is we did have KPMG, who does our auditing. They verified our process. So we asked them to look at our process to say, is it robust, from a statistical analysis, is it the right tool? So we went that direction and they verified the process. So that's where we are.
Thanks very much, Kristin. So I know I said that was just one more question, but I've literally got one other question here, actually, which is around, sorry, and then I promise we will move on.
No problem.
And we will ask other questions later. But any advice around actually getting the executive sponsorship for the groups? I know that you said that your chairman was very supportive and everything like that. We've had mixed comments about how people have found this within their organizations. Any advice on how to really truly get that buy-in at exec level, either to make sure that we're getting the exec sponsors, or at chairman, CEO, external mouthpiece type level, if that makes sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's a journey, because at first I would not say that all senior leaders were like, this is great. I mean, we had senior leaders, we had people that run the region like a Russia who said, what's this? I don't understand this at all. And so it wasn't like Russia was the first ERG that was established. That just was established last year, actually. So the first thing I would say is it's very, in this journey, pick the right, help you, the groups, because they need support, but they're going to be forming the ERG to select the right executive sponsor. So I'll give you an example. Voce, when we brought it to Italy and we had that very low, participation at the beginning, then we had a brainstorming which GLT, which is our global leadership team, first line of the CEO, which GLT member should we select to be the executive sponsor? And someone said, well, let's select the chief marketing officer, someone who was, a bit more junior. And I said, well, who's going to have the biggest reach? Who has the most number of people working for in their organization? Our head of supply chain. So 5,000 people, because it's all the factories, etc. Wouldn't it be great if Antonio would be the executive sponsor, if we could ask him and he would do it? At first he didn't really understand what the role was. It wasn't like, I didn't want to do it, but he said, I'd love to be a sponsor of all differences. I think we should be accommodating every difference because differences are important. And so he was very open to the idea of diversity, but didn't really understand what his role could be. So we actually he had some sessions with David Mixner and talking with some other of our partners that work on LGBT in different organizations, and then really understood that, even though he didn't feel that there was any invisible needs of the LGBT community, he started to realize that, that's not the case. We didn't have any open and out LGBT employees in Italy. But having him as an executive sponsor, you can imagine the reach when he speaks about it, being the Voce executive sponsor, and we video him, or he does a presentation at town hall, or he's on a panel talking about why it's important to executive sponsor. It has a big reach. So if you can find the people, don't always pick an enthusiastic, but also pick someone who could be part of their own learning journey. Then if you have a CEO who believes ERGs are going to help the organization, or the chairman like our Guido Barilla, and they could speak about it or join an ERG. We had a kickoff of our multicultural ERG. We had our chairman speak, and then afterwards he came over and said, I want to be a part, I want to join this ERG. And so it starts kind of, the informal words in the corridor start happening, and people, sometimes people will join because they think it's the thing of the year, but then when they get involved, they really see that they can make a difference. So as I was mentioning before, we had 20 people starting in 2015, and you can click and you can see what I already mentioned is that now in 2020, if you go to the next, just click it once. I think the number comes up. Yeah, so now we have 15 ERGs. We have them in all regions. And I'll talk a little bit about in the next slides, as we have a couple different models, because I think many companies have, so let's talk about this first. So what we found is the key elements of successful ERGs is what I already mentioned: the senior leadership sponsorship, good consistent communication, recognizing leaders, and also realizing, which was a hidden benefit, is you actually get to see some leaders that you wouldn't necessarily have seen. They get recognition because, like, for example, every time the D&I board would travel, and we did before COVID, go to different sites for our board meeting, and we would always have the ERG come in and give us a presentation. So you have Chairman Guido Barilla, the CEO, the D&I board, including our external experts, the ERGs presenting, and they're getting a lot of feedback, positive, get recognition. How many chances do different people at different levels can present to the chairman and the CEO? And we're finding like this kind of blossoming leadership skills of people that maybe we wouldn't see it so early because they're at different levels in the organization. I've already talked about cut and paste. It didn't work, so you have to take the cultural elements in. And we have D&I board members for our major geography, so they're the ones telling me. I'm not exactly the expert on how the employees would form a group in Russia, but I have a board member that's the head of marketing of Russia, so she is the one that tells me no, and she's actually working to help that ERG form and to get the right sponsor. Set clear guidelines, but allow us some flexibility locally. And then we have developed tools. We have a toolkit for the ERGs in the offices. We have one for the ERGs in the factories. We do 3 times a year a virtual sharing session. We do some specific training, like we're going to have training in 2 weeks for the ERG leaders on inclusion nudges. You might have heard that Tina Nielsen and Lisa Kapinski have a lot of work that they've done on nudging, like little behavior changes you can do to increase inclusion. and Lisa's on our board. And so they're going to be conducting a session for the ERG leaders in the D&I community on inclusion nudges. So giving them these tools, making them kind of ambassadors as a community. So that's just an example. It's our ERG Open Day that we had in Parma back. You can see it was in 2016. Yeah, 2016. Trying to get, and at that time, and we had 5 ERGs. We have one there for disability, which was formed by employees who want to be have more inclusion of people with different abilities. Welcome is for multiculturality, and young generation is the generational ERG, which I think is quite novel because not so many companies have a generational ERG, but it's really working well with reverse mentoring. And so they're actually, we'll see in a few slides, developing and leading programs.
Just a couple of questions.
Yes,
again. We had one here saying, what exactly is a little nudge in inverted commas? So wondered whether you could ask that, just because you've just mentioned it there with the individuals doing the talks around the little nudges. And also another question actually around hiring quotas, which is quite an interesting one, because I think
hiring quotas, okay. Other than nudges, I'm not the expert. I mean, you can take a look, just Google inclusion nudges, and you can see the website that Lisa and Tina have. And there's actually free downloads of guides to have some nudges. Like, I'll give you a simple example, and they're the experts, but I'll give you a simple example. You're in a meeting, it's different genders, and a woman talks and someone speaks over her, because it happens quite often that maybe a man kind of cuts her off, and maybe unintentionally, not even. You could say, wait, I think that Layla didn't finish what she was saying. There's small little things you can do every day. And we've asked them to also, because they're doing more research. And so they've just kind of updating their guides that we wanted to actually talk about virtual inclusion. So in this new, partially virtual working, partially people in the office, how do you, in meetings or in whatever environment, ensure that the people that are virtual are being equally listened to. But I would suggest you go on the website and you can download their guides for free. And they also have some books they're publishing. They just told us they should be ebooks on Amazon. The hardcover is now on there. It's nudges for leaders. They have a nudges for allies and a nudges for talent discussions, which I'm going to be ordering on Amazon because I don't have them yet. But they're going to have the ebook, they said, in 2 months if you want to not get the paper.
Thanks, Kristen. And we'll put some links into the end of this into the end of today's session as well, along with kind of key learning pieces and the slides and everything like that for everyone to view, whether you're here right now, which is great, or whether it is that you're viewing this on demand. But I personally think little nudges do make a huge difference. There's often those little things because, we've seen before people feeling overwhelmed with there being so much information, especially if they're not, well versed on inclusion, diversity, equality, etc. But actually, as you say, they're kind of, targeting, small pieces that make a big difference, through this kind of emotional connection, but then also, having something which is really simple that you realize, hang on a minute, I do that all the time. Like you say, not necessarily intentionally, but does it set a certain tone and end up resulting in a certain cultural behavior perhaps that you don't want. If there are small things that people can be aware of, they may be unconsciously doing, then can make a big difference. Okay. So thank you very much for that. And just in terms of the other question there as well, wondered your thoughts around quotas. And I mean, I personally don't like the word quota. I think quota does almost set that slight, that slight tone. I personally prefer, goals and what have you, but love to know your thoughts on quotas. And also one of the questions that I did miss out before, apologies for that. I'm getting these on my phone via the team because I don't want to, stop the share. And we had another question around engagement during COVID, because you've got some pretty impressive numbers there. And obviously I know some of this will be networks and systems and obviously, communities, but how you kept that engagement and that momentum during COVID, in addition to your thoughts on quotas, basically, and then we'll move on. Okay, sure.
So let's do the quotas. I'm with you, Layla. I think that the word kind of connotes a type of bringing someone in who is maybe not qualified, and then the people that are there say, well, wait a minute, why didn't I get the role? You know, I don't think any woman would like to have an unqualified woman take a position. So we have approached it via KPIs, because again, you know, you achieve what you measure. And even if you set very high targets for yourself and you don't achieve it in that year, it's still important to set a target, because if not, you're not moving the ball forward. So like for gender pay equality, you know, if you haven't assessed where you are at the company, do that first. And then if you say, well, it's going to take 10 years to eliminate, but at least have a 10-year plan. You know, the point is, I don't think a lot of companies have gone into the details, because it's quite a bit amount of work. I know that. But our KPIs on numbers are about having 50% of our managers globally be women, so in the managerial levels and above, so D2 and above, and 50% of our talent pool to be women, which just seems, you know, that's the world, so that's what we should have in the company. We're not at 50% women in the managerial above. And some countries are, you know, are ahead and are more than 50, and some, like Italy, are less, and they're in the, you know, early 30s. So we're only at 37%. So we have work to do, and our goal was to achieve it by this year. So it's not going to. We need to set a goal. We need to keep pushing it, and we evaluate every 6 months the demographics of every region, of all the levels in women, and try to see if we have identify any areas that are of issue. Like, are women leaving in a certain levels in a certain country? And we saw a lot more that they were leaving in a certain time frame, because we didn't offer enough flexibility. This was pre-COVID. I mean, back in 2010, when I started at Barilla in Italy, there was no flexible working. It's very traditional in Italy. You go to the office every day. Well, you can imagine how that limits having diversity of people who have different needs and different commitments outside of work. So in 2014, we started the Smart Working program, and then it's moved to now 40% of your time, but then COVID, it moved to 100%. Even before a lockdown, we told everyone to work from home. And we were prepared, because we had laptops for everyone. We had the IT tools. We've been training people since 2014, but we still learned a lot. So I'm back on the point about, I think you have to realize that, you know, put in some KPIs, some metrics. There isn't meritocracy. I have a discussion. People say, well, I just believe in meritocracy. We shouldn't be having to put in numbers or push a certain group to be more visible, because it's meritocracy. But realize everyone is biased. We all have biases. So there is no such thing. Meritocracy would be like, okay, we could just equally assess everyone, and we wouldn't have no bias come into our decisions. It doesn't happen. So we need to think about the underrepresented groups. Like in our America office and plans, we have targets for people of color, and we need to go out and find those talented people. You know, we're now developing targets for people with different abilities, because we just joined the Valuable 500. And if you haven't seen this, take a look at it's a really quite great initiative about inclusion of people with disabilities, and we're developing our commitment for that. So I think, you know, you have to take steps, and it can't be perfect, and you might not achieve your goal, but that's more the approach I personally think is more successful. The second question, is anything on that, Layla, that I should?
Well,
question?
you did touch on one of the other questions, actually, was Italy having an old population and whether this was reflected in the workforce.
Of older population? Oh yeah, very much reflected in the workforce. And that's why our generation ERG is really doing a lot of great work. I mean, our average age in our headquarters, which is also, we have the headquarters office, we have the largest pasta factory in the world, you know, our research organization, all on the same site. The average age is like 49, average. People here in Italy, you have to work until you're 65 or 67, depending on if you've gone to university and depending on, you know, whether you're, you know, what your background is. 67, you have to stay in the workforce, because you don't get your full pension if you don't. So it's quite different than maybe some of the audience who have different types of countries, the pension schemes. So you tend to have a workforce that has the younger generation and the older generation together. The ERG is doing great to connecting those different groups, and making sure that we don't lose the expertise from the people who are more experienced with a younger group who doesn't know how to connect with them, and then vice versa with technology, etc.
I think that is excellent, and I think what you've discussed there as well, with the mention of America and the Valuable 500, and we know Caroline Casey well, actually, who's done a brilliant job with her story, and again we can put links into the Valuable 500. is that every country is different. That makeup of individuals within that community, within that country, within that factory, all very, very different. And also wondered, sorry, one last question here. I'm like Columbo, constantly asking one more question.
But we had the one I didn't answer, which was about the engagement during COVID. Or maybe that's the one.
Yes, that would be a great one. And also, just because it's relevant to this, I was going to ask it later, but one of our members actually asked quite specifically about when rolling out a self-ID identification campaign in a global company, how have you overcome cultural and legal barriers to collecting sensitive personal data? And I thought it was opportune to kind of ask that question there, just because you mentioned the fact that in America, specifically, you're looking at, ethnically diverse talent and reaching out, which I think is key, because you're looking at the suite of what you need in comparison to who is actually within within the organization, within that vicinity.
So the question, I'll go to the one that you asked about self-identification. We have not done that. We've used the data that's available that legally you can. In America, of course, you can for ethnicity and race. In Europe, which is most of our population, we haven't. So even on our D&I survey, we thought that in the future we might have an optional self-identification part where people could, say whether they're a different ethnicity, have a disability, LGBTQ plus as they choose. We haven't done that. We're evaluating that for our next survey, which will be next year. I know I'm a member of the European D&I Conference Board, and that's one of the discussions in our meeting coming up. Is I think the only company I know that has done a survey where they ask employees to self-identify was Uber. But they didn't have a high participation. I remember it was like 30%. So there's also people, that's one of the reasons we haven't done it previously in our survey, because we wanted to drive higher participation, encourage higher participation. And we felt after we told you that your data is anonymous, at the end putting questions saying, please tick one of these, people would say, wait a minute, especially since our survey is quite, recent. Now, as we have done already 4 surveys, people can feel more comfortable. We think it might be the right time. So I don't have a good answer to say that we've done that. We haven't.
But it's a good point to make, and I'm really glad that this has come up and that question was asked in specific. Not only because, as you know, we have developed the Mackenzie Dellis Packer review, which looks at all those 10 different facets, and if anyone wants that as diagnostic, we can send that. It is qualitative and quantitative data, and I think for anyone who is listening in, it's important to note these are all measured in very, very different ways. So, some things are legal, some things are not. Some things are far easier to track, such as gender, obviously, and there's legalities around the gender pay gap, starting to get there, we hope with the ethnicity pay gap. But we've asked in our survey, for example, do you track your ethnicity pay gap, knowing that it isn't somewhere, but at least if we can start to get that data and start to measure every year, it'll improve, and every year there'll be more engagement. But I think, the other point, just picking up on one piece that you said there, is when it comes to kind of asking people, and sometimes maybe seeing low scores, or what you'd said there with the diversity council, is actually it's a bit, I don't like the expression, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation. Is we hear from employees and various employee forums that they feel potentially suspicious about why they're being asked these questions if the culture, the employee resource groups, the narrative and the culture of the company is not feeling inclusive. And so actually, if you're doing all of those pieces, and do correct me if you think differently, Kristin, this is just my view, that if all of these great things being done, employee resource groups, driving engagement, developing the narrative, the company culture, all of those kind of pieces, the engagement levels when it comes to employee wellbeing surveys or self-identification surveys, which will become more in-depth, I'm sure, over time, those response rates are likely to be driven up, because it's not viewed as purely an HR initiative and they're having to do this and it's an us versus them kind of scenario.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, you think about our survey, because again, it was new for almost no employees had been asked any of these questions before. In 2014, because we did a survey for every employee except manufacturing, because we did only 1 plan per country, because we have 25 plans and mostly don't have emails, so we wanted to do a kind of a pilot. we had 60% participation the first year. And this last year, so it was the fourth one last year, we had 85% participation. And a lot of it was driven by communication, but also the ERGs and the D&I community members and the board members and even the global heads, you know, saying, look, you know, we even the CEO having a video saying, you know, tell us what you think, you know, let your voice be heard. We don't, you know, we're not going to be, we want to use this to lead us into being a better company. But that, you know, that went from 2014 to 2019. It took 5 years. So, you know, again, you have to kind of go, but you can use your ERGs to do a lot of this communication because they are the colleagues of all these different people. The ERG leaders are not the highest level person in the organization. They're everywhere. So they're really the one, that's why I said they're really the ones that can be the you know, the people on the ground really making a faster culture change.
Yeah, they're the force and they are the drivers, the boots on the ground indeed. And so when this survey and these questionnaires came out and you got these levels, for them, it's not actually any kind of shock necessarily. It's not something that would be unusual because there's all of the other peripheral communications that's gone around that.
And you'll see later on in I think a few slides in advance, some of the survey results we've seen since 14 to 19, what we've seen the change in how people perceive acceptance of differences, which I think is driven a lot by ERGs. I won't forget maybe we answer the other question about the ERGs during COVID as I go a little bit forward, but it's just an example of what the ERGs do. And they're organizing in these events themselves. We have ERG in one of our factories. It's about gender work-life balance. More flexibility. So just examples of the things that can happen around the world if you give the framework. And we do give a budget. Someone's asked me that before. Do you give a budget to ERGs? So how is that managed? If an ERG is in a country or a region, the regional president has to put some money in his budget somewhere for the ERGs. We're not talking 50,000 euros. I mean, it can be as little as 5,000 euros. And then here in Parma, where we have 5 ERGs, it comes out of the D&I budget because we don't have a specific just only region here. We have this central headquarters. But we do give a budget. We have to prioritize and we have to guide them to not do too many activities. And so, you know, but it's more of an oversight and they're the ones generating a lot of great work, and a lot of great activity. You go to the next slide. So the VOCHA ERG expansion taught us some very good lessons. And one of them was don't cut and paste. The other piece was, you know, look at Italy. I mean, in a country where civil unions was only legalized at the end of 2017. You know, you can see Italy's numbers. 2018, we have, you know, there's 160. Now we have over 200 members, really. And we had last year, someone who publicly in one of our events came out. We've had people coming out of factories, telling more of their colleagues about their own, not having to hide their authentic self. And I think that, you know, Antonio Coppercini, who is the ERG executive sponsor, said, my goal is to have the place in Parma where we don't need this ERG anymore. Because every single person that works there is like a member of VOCHA, so you don't need an ERG because, you know, the voice is heard naturally in the business. Also, ERGs can develop unique ideas into real programs. The reverse mentoring program I mentioned before, it's really, I mean, we've gone through a pilot and it's expanded, a lot of feedback that's very positive. Senior leaders who are being mentored by people that are in all sorts of ways. And it's really quite nice to see that exchange between different generations. And it's, you know, they're all 4 generations that work together are participating. This is a small thing, but, you know, our multicultural ERG welcome in Italy developed a program so that, you know, in all of our cafeterias, including all our factories, once a month or twice a month, a different recipe from around the world. Now, you say, well, that doesn't sound so dramatic and life-changing, but think about it. You know, if you are working in a factory and you've never been to Cuba or you've never been, you know, to Russia, having a chance to taste one time a different culture's food to understand a little bit about their, you know, and there's a video that goes with it that's shot by the ERG with our colleagues from Russia who have recommended this recipe and it's cooked in the canteen. It just gives you a sense of the cultures around the world and how they're different and how you can learn more about them to be better and more inclusive. Local ERGs decide focus areas relevant to their culture. This is a bit of the hybrid that I was mentioning before, but I didn't get into the details. So many ERGs traditionally, and we have those as well, focus on one affinity. So like VOCHA for LGBT inclusion or visibility for inclusion of people with different abilities. But we have a lot of sites that have small numbers of employees. So in Brazil, you can see up in the right top right, there's Respeto. That's a Brazil, our ERG, because we have 50 people work in Brazil. But if we said, your ERG needs to be about one certain affinity, you might have 3 people in this one and 5 in that one, and and it would be very kind of cutting things very small. So we said, form your ERG. You need to have the same governance. You need to have a charter, executive sponsor, but you can change your area of focus every year if you think that there's something coming in the culture or something that needs to be addressed in the organization. So for example, Inclusivo, which is in the middle, which means inclusive, is our Canadian ERG. And they're working on last year, understanding better the cultures of the immigrants that are coming mostly to Canada. So there's 3 or 4 cultures where most of the immigrants are coming in, to understand how that will not only affect, the culture of the country, but can also affect, how you sell pasta, etc. So there's business aspects to this. So this is like, in this picture on the left-hand side is an activity by our Harmonia, which is Harmony ERG in Greece, about working with retailers that sell our products to have more accessibility for shoppers that have different abilities, like actual training on how you can make your store more accessible for people in wheelchairs or people who have hearing and sight impairment. And, so that also we had a pasta experience in a refugee camp in Greece. The manager day in the plant is Russia, trying to basically have different generations and different leadership styles interact with each other to understand better how they can work together and understand each other better. So these are all ideas from the ERGs. We did not push or focus on them on any way. We just support them.
We actually had a question here around disability, specifically disability inclusion. I thought perhaps a good time to ask, because you were talking about accessibility. I wondered, sorry, does anyone have any examples of good practice to support people with disabilities when thinking about development and promotion or internal hiring activities?
So the question is, do we have best practices?
Yeah, so the question is, and again, I know it is quite a specific one here, is basically this individual's seen there's a lot of recommendations, policies and practices which support people with disabilities through various pieces, through recruitment and selection and things like that, but wondered whether you or anyone else here would have any examples of good practice that they've experienced to support people with disabilities thinking about development and promotion and internal hiring activities.
Okay. Well, I think that for sure there's a lot of best practices out there, and I go back to take a look at the Valuable 500, because each company that's joined and we're joining has to set commitments, and you'll see some best practices in there in the commitments. So if you click through the companies, there's a lot of different ways the commitments have been developed by these companies. Some of them are hiring. Lever has a very strong commitment to hire, I think it was 5% of their population of people with different disabilities by a certain year. Some are talking more about accessibility in the offices, diverse hiring. One thing that we're in the process of developing our commitment. One thing that, I think you can look at disability inclusion in all ways, and we're a food company. And so we started piloting a program called Hackability here in Italy in 2017, and then we extended to France last year. And it's an interesting program where you bring in designers, the hackability designers, with consumers with disabilities and our employees. And together they design packages and kitchen tools to open packages. And it was really eye-opening for all of us, to understand how some of our packages are not accessible, but what we thought would be the solution to accessibility was not what they needed. And I give you an Italian example from the Italian hackability. So we had one consumer who's blind. And of course, here in Italy, we like pasta. We eat pasta every day. He had to buy all of his pasta the same shape because, in Italy, al dente, to the tooth, is so important. You don't overcook your pasta. So the important thing is to have the right cooking time for each shape. And each shape has a different cooking time, as you know, okay? So, but the packages are all the same, and because he couldn't tell if it was penne or farfalle or fusilli, he bought, 10 boxes of one. Someone told him what the cooking time was, and he cooked all of those, and then he could go and buy 10 more boxes of something else, another shape. So he said, all I need is in Braille is the shape and the time. I don't need the ingredients. I don't need everything. Because, it becomes very costly, and how do you fit it all in a box if you cover everything? So he said, just two things. And so, you know, it changes your way of approaching what you think could be very complex is not so complex. And now we're looking at QR codes and not even Braille. So how do you put the QR codes in the same place? And all they, you know, people say, the consumers told us just that's what I want. So I know that doesn't exactly answer the question about, hiring, but, you know, there are sites that you can use in like Job Me Too, which I think is very good. We're also going and saying, let's go to the universities. Many universities have an office for students with disabilities. Going there and talking to them saying, we have, you know, first thing is to get the positions. You know, I have an open position in finance and one in here and one there, and say, these are the type of different people I could hire for those positions, and then try to get them, because sometimes it's also hard to find, to match the, you know, the talent with the opening.
I've got the team here messaging me about various different pieces. We have got another couple, so what we'll do is we'll get through the rest of the presentation. If they're not answered, I will ask Kristen at the end.
And then also, yeah, we can do the one about during COVID. I think that I have just a few more slides, but I can do those pretty quickly. It's just, again, we have ERGs in our factories. I think the point I want to make about the factory is generally what I heard from other companies is they have factory employees in their ERGs. They tend to be the management levels, and they join the ERG in general. We wanted the ERGs to extend to our hourly workers. So what we did is we actually got an agreement that some of the training hours for the factories workers would be allocated to ERGs. Not 100% of the time that they need, but to get it started, to support them, because the view in Barilla is that the ERGs will actually make the work environment more productive. That they will not only make it more inclusive, they will find areas to make it improvements. Because, you know, a group that gets together, if that's very diverse, is going to come up with lots of ideas, and some of them, and so that we have this belief that it will eventually end up being a productivity, and that's not why we're doing it, but we think that that's why you can support it with actual money hours. Here's our Bolu factory in Turkey, had an LGBT event for Pride Month. And Melfi is our one of our factory outside of close to Naples, and they work on supporting children with disabilities, just some examples. So you could go to the next. So how do we communicate the benefits and engage managers? This is our CEO, Claudio Colzani. You can see that he made a quote for the CEO action we joined, and that was his quote. But when he travels, he has breakfast with the ERGs. He wants to have it as part of his business trip. So I want on my agenda to talk to the ERGs. As I mentioned, we had a year of ERG, and we gave awards for ERGs. And we have, as I mentioned already, town halls, open days. It's a way to, you know, to basically say this is an important part of our D&I journey and the company engagement in general. You go to the next slide. How do we measure the effectiveness? I already talked about, and I won't spend time on the survey, but I'll just show you the result of this survey, the 2019 survey, that did show us if we've been making some changes and being more inclusive based on the ERGs. So if you go to the next slide, I think is the one that, yeah, so since 2014 to 2019, we've seen an increase in the question that says, someone with a different sexual orientation would be equally valued in my work group. Someone from a different culture would be valued, a different language, a different ability, all went up significantly everywhere in the world, including countries on LGBT or sexual orientation. You wouldn't think would, like for Russia, have gone up, but they did. You go to the next slide. So 3 key learnings. A global framework with a common governance is important, but local flexibility. I told you there's the hybrid, there's the plant type ERG, there's the ERG about one affinity, like LGBT inclusion, leaders active as sponsors. You know, recognize the ERG leaders, give them, motivate them, and communicate consistently. This might be a good point, Layla, to add a comment about someone who asked the question about during COVID, how did the ERGs stay engaged and how did they help the employees? Yeah, it's a challenge to, you know, especially in cultures where, you know, getting together is really quite important from a motivational perspective, but we did a couple things. First is the D&I Board asked, and the CEO, who's part of the board, asked the ERGs to go during COVID back through your network of all your ERGs, have meetings to discuss in whichever way you want, whether it was virtual, whether it was via SurveyMonkey, what are the needs and challenges being faced now by the ERGs and the ERG colleagues. So kind of an informal focus group, but it was nice because HR wanted to do this also, but they were going to have to go and pay money for focus groups, set it up, and we have the ERGs. So the ERGs did it, and they gave us a lot of good information, which we then summarized into some key areas that you probably have all dealt with during the challenges during COVID. mental health, how to support parents, working parents, elderly parents, this C and B scene culture versus the virtual work. So those are the ones that we're now addressing. Now we're working on how do we have the new way of working, and we've had some different programs launched to provide support. So it was really very good that the ERGs were engaged, and they were happy to do it because they wanted to keep working on something. The second thing is we had virtual, open days. We had open to all the ERG 1,300 members around the world, with a fireside chat with David Mixner on what it's like to be LGBT during COVID. We had a presentation on hostile words and how words cannot be inclusive. We're having this inclusion nudges. So trying to do some events to keep the ERGs learning and realizing they're an important part of the company and giving them something to work on. So now becoming ambassadors of inclusion in the new way of working. So I think that, if you give a kind of a goal and you try to continue to reward them for their work, which may be in a different way now, we hope that continue the motivation.
First of all, I must say thank you ever so much. I think you've given an absolutely brilliant and in-depth, really good overview of employee resource groups, the journey, where you've been to where you are right now, and you've got some obviously, excellent achievements there.
We have a lot of work still to do, though. I don't mean to make it sound like we've had everything solved. I mean, I think it's it's a journey, and you take steps, and you look at things, and you say, oh, that didn't work, and okay, we need to do it a bit differently. And I have to say, we have some ERGs that are starting and have kind of sputtered a bit. We have a new ERG that's formed in Singapore for different religions. And I think because they're formed during the COVID times, they're trying to figure out how does that actually work. So sometimes, more guidance is needed, more help is needed, but we definitely don't have it solved. But it's going forward. That's to say that.
Mm-hmm. And I really hear your modesty with that, especially when it comes to diversity and inclusion, because, like we said earlier, diversity and inclusion practitioners always hungry and impatient for change, and recognizing that this is, it's a journey that is never going to be complete is key. But I think, recognizing also what has happened and the positive steps on that journey, so very important. And I know we've gone slightly over on time here. So what I will say is anyone that has any further questions, obviously, please do get in touch and feel free to reach out as well to Kristen.
Yes.
I will ask one more here, which is quite relevant to what we were just talking about, which is, obviously, Barilla has seen quite a turnaround in the last 6 or 7 years in terms of the outlook on equality, which is very positive. And I think, clearly, for what we can see here in the chat and the messages that have come in, you've done a great job with it. Can see that the consistency in terms of scoring the highest possible score for many years, running on the Human Rights Campaign Corporate Equality Index as well as there, so it does come out in the branches as well of what's been achieved. This individual is wondering around, kind of the driving factor basically, and whether this was public pressure, senior leadership decision, or indeed driven by employees. And I think it's a reasonable question. I know that actually I think a number of these pieces have been covered throughout the presentation, which I think is excellent. But I know there are a couple who were anonymous who had said they are struggling with certain issues, internally and externally with comms and things like that, chosen not to mention names of companies, but actually gave, real kind of, took the hat off to what you've done to turn this around and want to be able to basically do the same.
No, it's a good question. And I think, I think the first thing is to do the work internally. You see around the world, especially with Black Lives Matter, some companies who made big external commitments and then it found out internally they haven't worked on D&I. So, you have to do the work internally. I'm not saying don't work in the community. I'm not saying that at all. Don't support the community, but do the work internally. And the first thing is you have to have leadership commitment. It's one of our metrics. I didn't mention the other metrics. I mentioned gender, but we have 4. And the other 3 are based on the survey. And one of the survey sections is leadership commitment. Is the CEO in the first line committed to diversity and inclusion? Is my manager open-minded? And so there's some specific questions. And we started at a place around 60% favorable, which say I agree or strongly agree, but 40% didn't. And our goal was to get, our goal is 100%, but our goal was to get to 85 by this year. We didn't make it, but we made a big jump. We made it up to like, I think up to 79. So you want to see that, you want to, make a big goal, and you want to see, but you need to get that leadership commitment. So if it's not your CEO who's going to be the spokesperson, or in our case, we have the CEO and Guido Barilla and the other two chairmen, Paolo and Luca Barilla, it's fantastic. But if not, you got to have a senior leader who's going to speak on behalf of this and be kind of the sponsor of the D&I initiative, who's going to have a voice of the CEO, or someone who's going to basically, and be willing to go out there when they do trips and say D&I is important, or ERGs are important, or some way that then people, then the employee, and then the job of the D&I person or team or council is to educate on why ERGs are important to the company. Then once that happens, I think employees will want to form them in some way. And then you can provide the governance and the support. But without leadership commitment, I can understand that, it was really tough. If this is something that's kind of just public, reaction to public pressure, or something that's not really felt in the company, because when you have that, people can just do a bit of, pink washing, even sustainability, greenwashing, and not really do the work inside. It takes the work, not just what you say. So I think finding those key leaders and responsible that have a voice, that will be willing to speak on behalf, is an important piece. And you want to get that before the ERGs, because if employees form a lot of ERGs, but there's no leadership commitment, they will be frustrated, because no one wants to listen to their ideas, and no one's going to want to take them forward into projects and support them, even though you may. So you need to have some senior, not every senior leader is going to be supported, but find a few.
I absolutely concur. These initiatives do not work if they are not filtered down from the top at the end of the day. As important as it is as D&I practitioners, to look at bottom up as well as top down, and mile wide and mile deep. And, we've heard quite a lot of D&I execs in our network are feeling quite a lot of, burnout at the moment, because there is so much to do. But they are so much more successful when this is communicated very, very clearly at the top. And we've heard quite sadly from a couple of individuals within the network really struggling to get budget and buy-in to actually have someone doing diversity and inclusion solely in CDO role, which to be fair is more commonly used actually in the States and worldwide. In the UK predominantly we do have heads of diversity and inclusion, or global diversity directors, not always necessarily called CDO. But to not have the support there to actually get someone who is at least going to be doing this as a full-time job, to bring together what is a lot of the time as well, people volunteering on top of their day jobs as well. It's just so challenging.
Yeah, let me say, Layla, because I know we're running out of time, but in Barilla, I'm not a full-time CDO. I have a business. I have two hats: a CDO and another hat, which I'm part of communications, and I was part of R&D. Every one of our D&I board members, internal board members, have two roles. So they post for this position, they are passionate about it, but they know it's on top of their job. So if this person is trying to get the argument to have the money for a full-time CDO, start softer. Say, can I have an existing passionate person be a half-time CDO, and then half of their work gets somehow allocated somewhere else? Then the budget is kind of a little bit more hidden. And can I form? And then
it can be proved.
And then can I form? No. And then can I form a committee and post these positions if you have internal posting, or assign people from around the geographic world that are passionate, who want to do this on top of their job, with their bosses who say, okay, I will try to take 10 or 20% away of their work so they can do the D&I work. And you'll see that's the model that, and we made mistakes at the beginning on how we formed the first committee, because it was more like a delegated to senior leaders. Then we started using the posting system or something open, and we had more, because if you're going to post this and it's on top of your job, you're going to be passionate about it. That could be a way that the budget is not so directly amount of somewhat one person's salary that I need to hire externally.
And I love your honesty as well with that, Kristin, because I think it's really important for everyone who is here and anyone who's listening on demand afterwards to know that you're not always going to get it right first time. We hear a lot of people, worried and concerned exactly over this being perfect. It's never going to be perfect. It's never going to be perfect, and there is always going to be challenges along the way. So don't worry about getting everything right. A lot of the time it is trial and error. you know, but, you know, with all of the great and useful tips from today, you know, especially with that exec sponsorship, you know, the governance, the engagement, you know, the allowing the employees to have that voice, which is what this is all about, you know, you will be able to get there, but just start somewhere would be my...
And if people have other questions or they want to get hints on the governance, we have a toolkit I'd be happy to share. I mean, it's nothing proprietary. It's you know, that's what's great about D&I. It's not proprietary. We share these practices. We learn from what your members are going to say too, and any questions I'm sure will be very helpful for us because we have a lot more things to learn in our path, and learning from others is the key part. The nice thing about starting D&I more recently is that people that have done this for 20 years, you know, inform us on the mistakes that they made, and so we don't have to make the same ones.
Exactly, and that is it. It is about the strength of that collaboration. So, you know, and what I loved was you had said in the presentation, don't cut and paste. Now, for everyone listening, don't cut and paste like for like and presume it will be the same because everything's different. But when it comes to collaboration and, you know, corporate
learning
copying,
from others,
we sometimes call it, exactly. You know, you will see certain things that would work for you, certain things that wouldn't be right culturally, and you pick and choose. That is the absolute beauty of it, and it is proven that through that peer-to-peer knowledge sharing transfer, that we get there quicker. Because look, you know, things are changing every single day. You know, it used to be LGBT, now it's LGBTQ+. You know, and there's an A actually as well. So, Kristen, I know that you are incredibly busy, and we really appreciate you giving your time to us and to the members as well today. I think it's been highly valuable. I know this already from the amount of questions that we have had. And if we haven't answered anything, or if you think of something later, please do, you know, not only, you know, share within our community, but, you know, do reach out as well to Kristen. You know,
yes, it's a pleasure. It'd be a pleasure. You can see me on LinkedIn. If you have questions, I'd be more happy to have a call. I mean, again, this is how we change the culture, is that we share with each other, learn from each other, and that makes a big difference in the world, I believe, not only for our companies, but for our employees and the community as a whole.